For decades, the Australian state concealed a program that ripped children from their families, erased languages, and handed power to white institutions, all under the banner of protection. The beneficiaries were successive governments and missionaries who believed they could reshape a nation by erasing its oldest culture. The truth matters today because the wounds of those policies still echo in the lives of survivors, in community health disparities, and in the ongoing fight for true reconciliation. The forced removal of Aboriginal children was not an isolated decree, but a sprawling system, one that normalized the taking of children in the name of assimilation, bureaucracy, and national progress. In 1910, a coalition of Aboriginal elders and a handful of sympathetic parliamentarians gathered petitions, testimonies, and newspaper clippings into a single, unignorable voice. Elders traveled from remote outstations to city halls, recounting stories of children never returned, of families left hollowed by grief. Their pleas were amplified in public hearings that forced the press to ask uncomfortable questions. Who was truly being protected? The answer rang clear when Aboriginal leaders, with the support of the emerging Aboriginal Unity Council, demanded that any removal be subject to judicial oversight rather than ministerial whim. The media coverage sparked a national conversation, shifting the narrative from civilizing mission to a matter of rights and justice. Emily Hartley, a progressive member of Parliament whose constituency bordered several mission stations, took up the elders' cause in the House of Representatives. She co-authored an amendment that required any child removal order to be reviewed by a court, with evidence presented from both the parents and independent cultural advisors. The text was terse but powerful. No child could be taken without demonstrable risk to their safety, not merely because they were Aboriginal. When the amendment passed, it signaled more than a legislative tweak. It marked the first formal acknowledgement that the state's paternalism had overstepped moral bounds. Sir James Mitchell, then Minister for Native Affairs, denounced the change as unnecessary interference, yet he could not prevent its enactment. The amendment did not end removals overnight, but it forced officials to document their decisions, creating a paper trail that later investigators would follow. For Aboriginal families, the new law offered a fragile shield, a chance to appeal, however slim, before a judge who might listen. The passage of the amendment ignited fierce opposition from those invested in assimilation. Sir James Mitchell rallied his allies, arguing that the state's duty was to integrate Aboriginal children into mainstream society for their own benefit. He proposed a revised program that shifted from outright removal to a system of custodial care overseen by white missionaries and government-appointed guardians. The Brotherhood of St. Michael, a powerful religious order operating many child institutions, welcomed the compromise, presenting it as a humane alternative to forced adoption. In practice, the new scheme reduced overt legal battles but preserved the core objective, removing children from their cultural environment. Courts now heard cases framed as best interests rather than cultural eradication, and judges often unfamiliar with Aboriginal customs tended to side with the state's narrative of progress. The compromise illustrated how a system can adapt its facade while maintaining its underlying intent, ensuring that the flow of children into missions and white households continued unabated. Even as the legal machinery tightened, Aboriginal communities began to forge their own defenses. Elders established cultural schools hidden within remote communities, teaching language, song, and ceremony to children who remained at home. Legal aid networks formed under the guidance of the Aboriginal Unity Council, offering counsel to families facing removal orders. These grassroots initiatives created pockets of resistance that preserved identity despite systemic pressure. Stories spread of mothers disguising their infants with traditional markings, of fathers guiding children through secret pathways to avoid patrols. The resilience was not merely survival. It was an active assertion that culture could not be erased by decree. Each clandestine lesson, each whispered story reinforced a collective memory that would later fuel the national truth-telling processes. The outbreak of war in 1939 reshaped Australia's labour market dramatically. With many white men enlisted overseas, factories and farms faced acute shortages. The government, desperate for workers, turned to Aboriginal youths, many of whom had previously been earmarked for institutional placement. Recruitment drives promised wages and training, a stark contrast to the fate awaiting children in missions. This pragmatic pivot reduced the number of new removals during the war years. Families who might have lost another child found temporary reprieve as their sons and daughters entered the wartime workforce. Yet the shift was not born from empathy. It reflected an economic calculus that valued Aboriginal labor when convenient, but reverted to assimilationist policies once the crisis passed. The brief respite underscored how external pressures could temporarily alter a system's operations without dismantling its foundations. After 1945, the global conversation on human rights intensified. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and later the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights placed Australia under international scrutiny. Indigenous activists leveraged this discourse to demand formal recognition of Aboriginal rights, citing the ongoing removal practices as violations of fundamental freedoms. In response, successive governments introduced policy reviews, establishing committees that included Aboriginal representatives for the first time. Though many recommendations were watered down, the very existence of these bodies marked a departure from earlier secrecy. The pressure forced the state to acknowledge, in official documents, that past policies had caused significant harm to Indigenous peoples, a phrasing that would later become central to reparative efforts. The 1990s brought the National Commission known as Bringing Them Home. Survivors of removal testified before a public hearing, recounting loss of language, identity, and family ties. Their voices, amplified by decades of quiet resistance, demanded accountability. The Commission's report documented over 100,000 children taken from their families, detailed the systemic nature of the removals, and called for reparations, including counseling services and formal apologies. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a national apology to the stolen generations, acknowledging that past policies had inflicted profound grief. While some critics argued the apology was symbolic, for many survivors it represented an official recognition of suffering, a necessary step toward healing. The reparative measures, though limited in scope, began to address intergenerational trauma by funding community health programs and supporting cultural revitalization projects. Had the 1910 amendment never been fought for, the scale of child removal might have grown unchecked, deepening the scar on Aboriginal societies. The divergence created a narrow corridor through which resistance could grow, allowing cultural institutions to survive long enough to re-emerge in later decades. Today, Indigenous languages once thought extinct are experiencing revival in schools and media, a testament to the resilience nurtured during those quiet revolts. The nation continues to grapple with the legacy of a system that once deemed Aboriginal children unfit for their own heritage. Contemporary debates over constitutional recognition, land rights, and child welfare echo the same questions raised a century ago. Who decides what is best for a child? Whose voice is heard in policy? The answer now leans toward inclusive consultation, yet the shadow of past policies reminds us that vigilance is essential. Reflecting on this altered path invites a sober assessment. Progress arrived not through benevolent decree, but through persistent advocacy, legal maneuvering, and cultural endurance. The story of the stolen generations is not solely one of loss. It is also a narrative of how an entrenched system can be challenged when those it oppresses find allies in unexpected places and refuse to let silence become permanent. The work ahead remains unfinished, but the echoes of that 1910 amendment continue to reverberate, a reminder that even within oppressive structures, moments of resistance can reshape a nation's conscience.